Very quick note before the video begins, if you're an ADHD fiend and just want to listen to the songs I remade, just click the timestamps ahead. Let's go back to the early 2000s. At the time I was playing my very first games, but the one that stood out the most was Pokémon Blue. It's safe to say that, even though it had good gameplay, the songs are a big part of what made the game iconic. Later, I would go on to play Pokémon Crystal, that not only revisited, but recontextualized the songs from the first game. As time went on, I continued to follow the franchise, but moving forward from the Gameboy Color, the soundtrack felt different. That is not to say the songs weren't amazing, the soundscape just changed with the technology. However, I always thought that the Game Boy songs had a unique charm to them, but I was never able to pinpoint what that was exactly. Fast forward to today, and I've been producing music for almost 15 years, ranging from electronic to orchestral. So I decided to attempt to recreate that same charm. Since I'm not one of the great composers from the Pokémon franchise, I decided to lean into their work. That way I couldn't blame the lack of charm on a crappy melody or chord progression that I made. So the very first question to ask is, how does a Game Boy handle sound? Well, it turns out that both GB and GBC sounds were handled by a sound chip referred to as the APU, which is short for Audio Processing Unit. The main difference from this to what we have in the GBA is best explained like this. The first Game Boys have their own conductor with 4 live players called channels. For the most part, channels make their own sounds, and the conductor can tell them to change the sound of their instrument in various ways. However, those Game Boys can never play more than 4 sounds at once. By comparison, the GBA has many phones connected to 2 speakers, and each phone has a different sound ready to play. It can play much more than 4 sounds, but since it has no conductor, that can be demanding since it also has to handle the rest of the game, so a limit still exists in practical applications. Now let's look into the channels. Channels 1 and 2 are commonly called the pulse channels because they can produce pulse with modulated waves. To understand that, here's a simple explanation of how sound and synthesizing works. Sound is nothing but air particles wiggling back and forth. As they move, they bump into neighboring particles, passing the motion along like a chain reaction. Eventually, this vibration reaches your ear, and the speed of the wiggling determines whether you hear a high or low note. This is what we call pitch. This movement through the air works much like waves in the ocean. As particles push forward, they create areas where the air bunches up and areas where it spreads out, leaving less air in the space they just moved from. The way these air clumps form and spread out changes the sound we hear. If the movement of the particles builds up smoothly, like rolling waves in the ocean, it sounds like this. But if we change it so the particles shift direction abruptly instead of moving smoothly, it sounds like this. Those shapes are called waveforms. The waveform played by channels 1 and 2 is the latter. Saying they can modulate waves means that they can decide how long the plateau is in relation to the valley next to it. They had 4 settings that they could pick from. Moving on to channel 3, this is known as the wave channel because it can make sounds based on waveforms given to it, which gave the composers a tiny amount of creative liberty regarding sound diversity. Finally, channel 4 is known as the noise channel because it produces a sound similar to TV static. That sound can be commonly referred to as white noise because, like a white light made from all the other colors, that noise is made up of all the frequencies. As it is, those sounds are very static, but there is one more element present in channels 1, 2, and 4 called an envelope. Envelopes are very common when you're making sounds from scratch. They are mostly represented by a small shape which can control one or more aspects of the sound. In the case of the channels, the envelope controls the volume of the sound over the time it is played. Instead of playing something static, you can now make it creep in, make it peak before settling, and make it trail off. At the end of the channel pipeline, the sounds are sent to a digital equivalent of speakers for the left and right ear, which then combine resulting in stereo sound. The proportions of how much goes to the left or right channel can be decided, making it possible to play sounds partially or mostly in one ear of the listener. Knowing all of this, I had to decide which songs to remake. I decided on remaking one song from each mainline Pokémon game after Crystal. I settled on recreating the song you first hear after going outside your house, as I felt it had the biggest emotional impact. Some of the songs are pretty easy to recreate. The internet provides MIDI files for a lot of tracks, which is an electronic way to store music notes. While searching, I even found a synthesizer meant to emulate Game Boy sounds, speeding up the process. The tracks that were not available in MIDI files I had to transcribe by ear. To do that, I did a pass transcribing notes while listening to only certain sets of frequency of the song: bass, bend, and high frequencies. Also, due to the constraint of only being able to play one note at a time, I had to chop chords to play single notes at a time like the old games did. That means that things like this turned into this. After all of this, even though the process was finished, the tracks didn't have the feel I expected. Take a listen to a small example. To understand whether it was the lack of stereo use or something else, I then recreated a song from Pokémon Crystal without using the synth I found. That made me utilize more of the envelope to create different sounds and to diversify what kind of sounds each channel was playing throughout the track. That got me better results. Here's the same example with the new sounds. But even after that, I still felt like there was something small missing, something that I couldn't put into words. Searching for it, I found an answer that satisfied me and it finally got me the results that I'll share at the end of the video. However, I couldn't find any reference of it other than in the truegaming subreddit, but the idea is that the way that the sound chip handled pitch, meaning how high or low a note is, was a bit flawed. Basically, our system of musical notes is simplified but mathematically incorrect. In a purely mathematical system, we would use the frequency of a note, which is how fast it wiggles, and multiply it by a ratio to find the frequency of other notes. A note with a frequency twice or half as fast is considered to be the same note, just in a different octave. To clarify, an octave is an interval that covers all the notes we use. So, let's say we get every note by going around in intervals of a fifth, a very nice interval used by most chords. To do that, we will only have to multiply our frequency by 3/2. Let's say we continue to do that until we return to our original note, dividing by 2 to return to the octave where we came from when we need. Knowing we have 12 notes, we can calculate that the accumulated multiplication of 3/2 would result in a ratio of 531,441 over 4,096. That means that if we multiplied by a number a bit over 129, we'd get the same note. If we keep dividing by 2 to go down to the octave we want, we discover that the same note is actually calculated to be a little bit higher than 2 times the original frequency. This is not a problem with the math that I did. The nature of the multiplication of these ratios results in a system where the notes would be a completely different set of frequencies depending on the one we chose to begin with. To combat this, the system we use nowadays compensates for it bit by bit until we get to the next octave. This is a very crude explanation, and I am by no means an expert on the subject. So not only do I encourage you to do some research of your own by searching just intonation, but also I'll link to a video from Neely in the description, with a warning that the language used there may be a little too technical. The flaw in the Game Boy sound chip is that it did not account for the small increments to the frequency of the notes. This can be demonstrated by making an instrument slightly out of tune while playing the same note as a song from the original Game Boy. Note that the sound has a choir effect when it's normally tuned, but perfectly sings when out of tune. So, The final touches were emulating that slight change in the pitch and making the sound a little crunchy to emulate a bad speaker. Here's an exaggerated example of what that did to the sound. I finally successfully converted modern Pokémon songs to a Game Boy cover. I'll just quickly ask you to subscribe and like before I leave you to enjoy the complete work.